Commander Relvin had served on the border of the Tyran quarantine sector for 4 months. In those 4 months, nothing had happened. That was the essence of the job. Nothing happening. That was what it had been created for. The Tyran quarantine sector was a wide, empty ring of space drawn around a lonely yellow star with one inhabited planet and a small moon. It had been established 80 years ago after a reconnaissance group filed a report, cataloged the species milling about on the third planet, and left. The report stated that the species was primitive, carbon-based, aggressive amongst itself, but not yet capable of leaving its own gravity well in any significant way. They had nuclear fission, they had early space probes, they had radio signals full of music, military reports, and something called a sporting event. The report recommended an observation interval of 200 years. Then it was filed away. Then it was forgotten. The Dominion had 140 member species to manage. One small, loud, non-spacefaring civilization on a damp rock in an unremarkable star system did not require constant attention. So instead, they established a patrol route, 2 frigates on a slow rotational schedule. The Patience of Time and her sister ship took turns at the border, watching as nothing happened, filing reports that nothing happened, and rotating every 4 months. Relvin's rotation had 11 days left. He was sitting in the command chair, reviewing maintenance logs, when his sensor officer, a young Ket woman named Asperian, made a sound he had never heard her make before. It wasn't a word. It was the sound a person makes when they see something and their brain refuses to name it. "Report," he said. She did not answer immediately. "Commander, I'm running a diagnostic," she said. Her voice was cautious, like someone walking on ice they didn't trust. He stood up and walked to her station. The sensor display was performing a standard scan of the border zone, the same scan performed every 40 minutes, the same one that had yielded nothing for 4 months, except that something was wrong with the results. There was a shape in the data that shouldn't have been there, a mass displacement reading that the system was constantly trying to normalize and failing. "What is that?" he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. A gravitational shadow. Something very large just dropped out of superluminal jump about 4,000 kilometers inside the border. He looked at the mass reading attached to it. He looked at it again. "That's an error," he said. "I've run the diagnostic twice. Run it again." She ran it again. The number didn't change. Relvin was a practical man. He had served in the Dominion Patrol for 19 years. He had seen equipment malfunctions, phantom sensor signals, spatial anomalies caused by wandering stellar objects, and once, a collision with a debris cloud that had knocked out 3 sensor arrays and made the ship appear as if it were inside a small moon. He had seen many things that turned out to be equipment issues. He told himself this was an equipment issue. "Pull up an image," he said. Asperian pulled up an image. On the screen were stars. The standard star field of the sector border, familiar, unchanging, boring except that a part of it was missing. Not dark, not a void, it had simply disappeared. A shape cut out of the star field as if something had been placed in front of it. Something solid enough that the stars behind it ceased to exist. Something that sat there in the silence of space and did not move. Relvin stared at it. "It's an eclipse shadow," Asperian said very quietly. Whatever this object was, it was large enough to block the stellar background at that distance. He made the calculations, not wanting to. At that distance, an eclipse shadow of that size meant the object was... He stopped the calculations. "Retrieve the anomaly report from the archive," he said. "The last 30 years. Anything in this sector." She retrieved it. The archive returned 30 years of boring micrometeorite collisions, a cycle of solar flares from the Tyran star, one recorded instance of an unidentified probe, small, primitive, metallic, which had drifted past the border 14 years ago and was catalogued as a Tyran deep space attempt. The probe was moving at a fraction of the speed required to leave the star system. It wasn't headed anywhere in particular, moving very slowly. It was the most interesting thing in 30 years until now. He filed a sensor malfunction report. He did it thoroughly. He described the anomalous readings in precise terms. He noted that diagnostic checks had not resolved the issue and recommended a technical review at the next rotation handover. He sent it to the sector station and set an auto-copy to the regional command log. Then he sat back in the command chair and stared at the hole in the star field. It didn't move. It didn't do anything. It just sat there on the edge of human space with the patience of, what? something that had waited a long time and was prepared to wait much longer. Prexton wasn't supposed to be on the Patience of Time. He had been assigned there 6 weeks ago as part of a new initiative to embed intelligence analysts on frontier patrol vessels, because someone at the top of Dominion Intelligence decided that real-time data analysis was preferable to the standard practice of collecting 4-month-long sensor logs and analyzing them in an office 6 weeks after the fact. Prexton wasn't thrilled about the assignment. He was 26 years old, and he had spent 3 years building a career in archive analysis. Precisely because archive analysis happened in offices, in warm, gravity-stable offices, not on patrol frigates at the edge of the world. He tried to make the best of the situation. He had a good chair. He had brought his own reference materials. He had established a routine. He felt fine. He was looking over a standard atmospheric composition report from the Tyran planet, levels of a specific industrial gas. They had been rising for 6 decades, which was exactly what you would expect from a developing civilization. Boring, just data. When Asperian made her sound, Prexton looked up. He saw the commander walk to the sensor station. He saw the commander look at the screen. He saw him ask for a diagnostic. For the 3rd time, he got up and walked over. The mass reading was still there. The eclipse shadow was still there. The shape in the star field sat before him on the screen, and his analytical brain immediately reached for the archive. "May I see the energy signature?" he asked. Asperian looked at Relvin. Relvin nodded. She pulled up the energy signature. Prexton stared at it. He had a good memory for signatures. He had spent 3 years in archive analysis, cross-referencing engine signatures from reconnaissance contacts, registered anomalies, and unidentified objects. His brain, essentially, was a library of what had appeared on sensors and what it turned out to be. He knew this signature. He knew its shape, the frequency pattern, the specific way the energy dissipated at the edges. He didn't know it from a current file. He knew it from an old one, a very old one. "Give me access to the contact archive," he said. His voice did something he didn't want it to. He kept it level. The full archive, starting 80 years ago. Asperian gave him access. He went into the archive and found the file from the original Tyran reconnaissance. He found the energy readings from the planet's nuclear facilities, early and primitive, recorded and cataloged. He found the motion signature from the space probes they had sent during that period. Small, weak, the output of something that hadn't yet mastered how to leave its own solar system. He pulled up that signature and placed it on the screen next to the current anomaly's signature. They were the same. The shape was identical. The frequency pattern matched. The dissipation profile at the edges was the same curve, the same physics, the same basic principle. A Tyran nuclear engine. Except he performed a scale comparison. Except that the power difference was 412 times greater. He performed it again. 412. He stared at the number. His brain tried to place it in the correct category. It couldn't find a category. It kept returning an error. 412 times the power of a primitive Tyran nuclear probe. But the same fundamental signature, which meant the same fundamental technology, scaled to. He looked at the eclipse shadow. He looked at the mass reading. He looked at the comparison of energy signatures again. In the 80 years since the reconnaissance group filed their report and flew away, humanity had taken the technology they had, small, primitive, barely functioning nuclear technology that they had in the year of first contact, and they had scaled it. They hadn't abandoned it for something cleaner. They hadn't discovered a different principle. They had taken what they had and built it bigger and bigger and bigger, until what now sat in the space before him worked on the same physics as those old probes, just as a mountain works on the same physics as a pebble. Relvin was reading over his shoulder. He remained silent for a while. "What are we looking at?" he said. Prexton had been doing this long enough to know that the first word spoken matters. Once a thing is named, it becomes real. A name lives in logs. A name is sent to the station. A name goes up the chain. He chose his words carefully. "It is an object of Tyran origin," he said. "The engine signature matches the Tyran nuclear motion profile from the first contact archive. The power difference suggests significant technological development since that reconnaissance. The mass and dimension readings suggest the object is a ship, a large one." Relvin looked at the eclipse shadow on the screen, at the part of the star field that had vanished. "How large?" he said. Prexton pulled up the size estimate from the mass reading. He looked at the number. He decided not to say it aloud. Instead, he turned the screen toward the commander and let him read it. Relvin read it. He fell silent. "In kilometers?" he said. "Is this in kilometers?" "Yes." The commander stared at the screen for a long time. Then he looked at the eclipse shadow, at its shape, at its patience, at the way it just sat there in the darkness, covering the stars behind it. "File a full contact report," he said finally. "Priority 1. Attach full sensor data. I want it sent to Sector Command within the next 10 minutes. "Ah, yes, Commander." Relvin returned to the command chair. He sat. He looked at the main screen, where the hole in the star field held its position. "Not moving. Did it emit any signal?" he asked. "No," said Asperian. "Nothing. No transmission. No active scanning. No navigational beacon. It arrived and stopped. It's just sitting there." Yes, he thought about that. A ship of that size with that much power, sitting at the border of the Tyran quarantine sector without transmission, without scanning, without any signals, just being present, just there. What bothered him, what he couldn't include in the report because it wasn't data, was the quality of that waiting. It didn't feel like an arrival. It felt like a resumption, like something that had always been here and had simply become visible, as if it had been doing this, had been ready, had been here, had been huge in the dark for a long time. He submitted the report to the regional sector station. The report from the Patience of Time arrived in a queue of 47 other reports and sat there for 2 hours before anyone opened it. The duty officer who opened it read it once, read it a second time, and then stared at the attached sensor data for several minutes. She opened the Tyran quarantine sector file from the main archive. She read the original reconnaissance report from 80 years ago. She read the assessment at the end, the one that said, Class F, no threat. Observation interval, 200 years. She looked at the mass readings from the Patience of Time sensor data. She marked the report as priority and sent it to the station commander's desk. Then she sat for a while and thought about the observation interval, 200 years. They were at year 80. In the remaining 120 years of that observation interval, someone on that planet had built what was sitting at the edge of their space. She thought about how it must have looked from the other side, standing on that small, damp planet, looking at the sky, where you knew, because they had come, the reconnaissance group had come, and left. You knew that something was out there, something that had found you, classified you, and left. She thought about what she would have done with 120 years of that knowledge. She was glad that the report was not her problem. She forwarded it and returned to her queue. Prexton was still at the sensor station when the ship finally did something. It had been 6 hours since its arrival. 6 hours while the Patience of Time sat at a safe observation distance and watched the hole in the star field. 6 hours of scanning, filing updates, waiting for a response from Sector Command that hadn't arrived yet. The crew ate rationed food. Someone slept. The anomaly remained exactly where it was. Exactly the same, doing nothing. Then the light changed. It was the only description along the visible surface of the object, the part that caught the faint light of the distant Tyran star. What changed? A shift in how the surface absorbed and reflected light. Navigation lights turned on. Navigational markers. Standard distance for a ship. For a ship. Asperian pulled up an image at maximum magnification. The whole surface wasn't smooth. It was layered. Plates over plates, thick, with gaps between them suggesting internal systems of significant depth. Along the upper surface were structures, towers, arrays, things that stuck up and out in ways suggesting purposes but not immediately declaring them. What was the purpose? Along the sides were recessed sections, darker than the surrounding hull, arranged in regular patterns, evenly distributed. Prexton looked at those recessed sections for a long time. He had done enough archive analysis to know what weapons ports looked like. He had seen the design philosophy of a dozen different space civilizations. The Dominion's own warships were elegant in that. Clean lines, minimal external profile. You didn't advertise. The recessed sections weren't hidden. They weren't camouflaged. They were just there. Just as a building has windows, just as a road has lanes. Infrastructure obvious and shameless. He started to count. He stopped counting because he needed to write something down, and there was nothing to describe it. Then his station received an incoming signal. The frequency was a standard Dominion diplomatic call. The language was standard Kitty Yan, the formal version, the version used in official communications between recognized parties. 11 words. Ambassador ship detected. Indicate preferred meeting coordinates. The bridge went quiet. Prexton read the message a second time. He parsed every word. Ambassador ship detected. They had identified the Patience of Time not as a patrol frigate or a military contact, but as an ambassador ship. Detected. They knew the frigate was there. How long before the frigate detected them or after? Indicate. The grammar was formal, but the please was real. An actually polite request, not a formula. Preferred meeting coordinates. They were asking where the Dominion wanted to meet. They had been sitting there for 6 hours in the dark at the edge of their space, silently waiting. And the first thing they said when they opened communication was a polite request for the Dominion's preferences. Relvin read the message from the command chair. He read it again. He looked at Prexton. Prexton thought about the archive, about the reconnaissance report, about the observation interval, about 80 years and a 4 kilometers long ship running on scaled-up versions of technologies that had existed at the time of first contact. They hadn't built something new. They had built something bigger, larger, stronger, with redundancies and layers and re-engineered in a way the Dominion philosophy of incremental escalation would consider irrational. And they had waited politely, at the edge of their own space, not crossing the border, not scanning aggressively, not making demands, just being visible and huge and patient, and asking, when they finally spoke, where the Dominion would like to meet. He thought about the note he would have to add to his report, the part where he would try to explain what 80 years of watching a sky full of unknowns had produced. He opened his log. He typed one line. We forgot to check what they were afraid of. Behind the porthole, the ship sat in the dark with its lights on, waiting for an answer. The stars behind it were still missing. The report from the Patience of Time arrived at the logistics desk of the High Council on Wednesday morning, which was unfortunate because Wednesday morning was reserved for the quarterly trade route review. And the trade route review had been scheduled 3 months ago, and 16 senior officials had rearranged their schedules around it. The logistician who received the report read it twice. She looked at the sensor data. She looked at the mass readings. She looked at the energy signature comparison that the young analyst had attached. The one where the 80-year-old Tyran nuclear motion profile sat next to the current reading like a child's drawing placed next to the building that had grown to become it. She forwarded it to the duty admiral with a note. Verification recommended before trade meeting. The duty admiral read it during the first break of the trade meeting. He did not return to the trade meeting. By the time the sun set on Wednesday over the Dominion's central world, 4 different departments had the report on their desks, and 3 different departments were pretending they didn't have it. The 4th department, the intelligence front, was the one that actually did something. They retrieved the full Tyran sector archive. They assigned a verification group. They sent an encrypted priority message to Admiral Vetsaran, the senior fleet commander of the Outer Western Tades, who, among those who worked with him, was known as an officer who does not panic, does not delay, and does not use words lightly. The message said, anomalous contact detected on the Tyran border. Verification required. Your discretion on force composition. Vetsaran received the message, read the attached report, looked at the sensor data, and spent 45 minutes in his office without speaking to anyone. Then he authorized a search fleet. 5 ships, the long thought of time, which was his own command ship, plus 4 escort frigates. A standard diplomatic configuration. Enough presence to be taken seriously, not enough to be mistaken for aggression. He wrote the order with the precise, unhurried handwriting of a man who had made a decision and no longer doubted it. He did not write anywhere in the order what he actually thought. Orders were not meant for that. The search fleet arrived at the Tyran border in 6 days. Prexton was on the long thought of time when they dropped out of superluminal jump, because the sector station commander had decided that the analyst who had discovered the anomaly should be present at the subsequent actions. Prexton had not been consulted on this decision. He had simply been transferred with his chair, reference materials, and a growing sense that his career had taken a turn he hadn't expected. The Patience of Time was still at its observation post. It had maintained position for 6 days. It continued to file hourly status reports. Every report said the same thing. Object is holding position. No aggressive actions, no movement, no further communication with aggressor. After the first one-word message asking for preferred coordinates, the ship at the border had said nothing else. It just waited. Vetsaran reviewed the 6 days of reports from the Patience of Time, while the long thought of time completed its arrival maneuver. Then he stood at the front porthole and looked at the object for the first time. He had read every number in every report. He had processed the mass readings, the energy signature, and the size estimate. He had done it methodically, as he did everything else, building a picture in his mind from the data so that visual confirmation wouldn't be a surprise. Even so, he was surprised. The numbers were correct. The numbers were always correct. But the numbers describing a thing and the thing itself are not the same. And the thing itself sat in the space before them, and it was very large and did not move. And it was the product of a civilization that had been filed away under the name Dominion Temporary Absorption and forgotten. He stared at it for a while, then turned to his sensor chief and said, "Full scan. Everything." The scan took 4 hours. Prexton sat at his assigned post on the intelligence deck of the long-thought-of time and watched the data come in. 6 other analysts around him were doing the same. Nobody spoke much. The hull was layered. That was the first thing the scan clearly established. Not a single shell of material between the internal space and space, as most ships are built, but multi-layered plates laid over plates. Each was thick enough to be an entire hull of a standard patrol frigate, with visible gaps between them suggesting shock absorption architecture, the type of design used when you expect the outer layers to be destroyed and the inner ones to remain functional. The scan detected 8 different propulsion systems, 8 separate ways of moving, each based on a different physical principle. All were running simultaneously at low power. The Dominion built for redundancy. Each critical system had a backup, but 8 independent engines on one ship is not redundancy. Redundancy is a spare. 8 is a philosophy. The scan detected weapons emplacements. Prexton had started to count them on the night of the ship's arrival. He had stopped and started again several times. The final count from the scan results was not a number he wrote in his main report. He wrote it in his supplementary report, marked for higher command viewing. The number was so large that writing it in a document that could be widely circulated felt irresponsible, not because it was secret, but because it was a number that changes how people think about things. And some people needed to be prepared before facing it. There were also crew numbers. A Dominion ship of comparable size and comparable here, the word comparable is used very loosely, because nothing in the Dominion fleet was truly comparable in scale, would carry approximately 300 crew members. The life scan on the Tyrant ship returned a count of just under 6,000. 6,000. The analyst conducting the life scan performed it twice. Then she looked at Prexton across the deck. He nodded. She entered the number in her report without saying anything aloud, which was the correct decision. Vetsaran read the scan results in his private office with the door closed. He was a man who processed information in order. He read from the top of the document to the bottom in order, skipping nothing. He had done this for 30 years, and it had served him well. You understand things better when you encounter them in the order the report writer intended. He read about the layered hull. He read about the 8 propulsion systems. He read the weapons count. He stopped there. He went back and reread the sentence before it, which confirmed the methodology of the count to ensure it was correct. It was correct. He reread the number. He moved on. He read about the 6,000 crew members. He read Prexton's supplementary note at the end of the scan summary, which stated, "Engine signature matches Tyrant principles of nuclear propulsion. Power difference from the first contact baseline is 4.12 times. No evidence of technology acquisition from external sources. Development appears internal and continuous over the 80-year period." Internal and continuous. They hadn't traded for this. They hadn't found a shortcut. They had taken the technology they had, primitive, early, barely enough to leave their own atmosphere, and worked on it for 80 years continuously. Vetsaran thought about Dominion doctrine, about incremental escalation. You build what you need. You expend minimal effort to achieve the required result. Wastefulness was considered not just inefficient, but philosophically a flawed failure of judgment, a sign of fear or overreaction. A civilization's military architecture was a direct expression of its values, and the Dominion's values stated, build cleanly, build minimally, build exactly what the situation demands. And no more. He looked at the scan data of the Tyrant ship. Whatever values had birthed this ship, they were not those values. He summoned Prexton to his office. The analyst arrived, looking as though he hadn't slept and didn't intend to. Vetsaran gestured to a chair. Prexton sat. "The original reconnaissance report," Vetsaran said. "Have you read it?" "Yes, Admiral." "Assessment, Class F. No threat. Observation interval 200 years." "Yes." Based on what you have observed over the last 6 days of first contact and this scan, what is your professional assessment of that conclusion? Prexton paused. The conclusion was accurate for the data available at the time of reconnaissance, he said. The reconnaissance group observed a civilization with nuclear potential, early space probes, and no superluminal technology. The conclusion that they did not pose a threat to the Dominion was correct, given those facts. 1. But the conclusion did not account for the trajectory, Prexton said. It evaluated where they were, not where they were going, and did not account for motivation. We cataloged their capabilities. We did not ask what would happen to that capability if they were given a reason to develop it very rapidly. 2. Vetsaran looked at him. And what was their reason? We, Prexton said. Intelligence. We came, we looked, we left. They knew we existed. They knew we were more developed. They had no idea if we would come back or what we would do when we came back. He paused. 80 years. That's not a long time for a civilization, but it is enough if the motivation is strong enough. The Admiral remained silent. I have an entry in my personal log, Prexton said. From the night of first contact. I wrote, we forgot to check what they were afraid of. I think that is an accurate summary of the analytical failure of reconnaissance. Vetsaran did not answer directly. He looked at the scan data on his desk, at the layered hull, at the 8 engines, at the weapons count. He wasn't going to repeat it aloud in this conversation or any other until he decided how to handle it. The ship has not moved, he said. It has not scanned us aggressively. It sent one message 6 days ago asking for preferred meeting coordinates and has said nothing since. Yes, Admiral, it is waiting. Yes, for us to answer, I think, yes. Vetsaran stood. He walked to his porthole. The Tyran ship was visible from here, distant but present. Its navigation lights burned steadily in the dark. It possessed the quality of something that was very comfortable remaining still, patient, so that it wasn't passive, more like a thing that had done everything it needed to do and was just waiting for the rest of the situation to catch up. 6,000 crew members, he said. I want your analysis on that. Prexton had expected this question. A ship of that size, optimally crewed by Dominion standards, requires about 300 people. The Tyran crew is 20 times larger. The excess crew cannot be explained by operational needs. It can only be explained by damage resilience planning. Explain. They built the ship expecting it to sustain heavy damage. The excess crew exists so that when significant parts of the ship are destroyed or on fire or otherwise non-functional, there are enough people left to keep the rest in working order. He paused again. They built for a scenario where most of their crew is dead and the ship still has to fight. The porthole framed the ship in the middle distance. Its lights burned steadily. The stars behind it were still missing. They built for the worst-case scenarios, Vetsaran said. They built for all the scenarios they could imagine, Prexton said, and for some they probably couldn't. The redundancy on this ship isn't engineering. It's psychology. It's the physical expression of a civilization that decided it wouldn't be caught without options. The Admiral turned from the porthole. He returned to his desk and sat. He opened the comm panel and found the channel that Asperian had logged on, the Patience of Time, the one the Tyran ship had used 6 days ago when it sent its 11 words. He drafted a response. It took him several attempts. The first version was too formal and sounded like a legal notice. The second was too brief and seemed dismissive given the circumstances. The third was too long and said too much about the Dominion's intentions before those intentions were properly authorized by the relevant councils. The fourth version read, Contact confirmed. Senior Command on station. S. Requesting direct communication with the ship's commander at your convenience. He read it again. At your convenience. A quote. He left it. It seemed right. It acknowledged, without saying it directly, that the situation had changed, that the Dominion was no longer the party setting the default terms. He sent it. The response came through in 4 minutes. Admiral Vetsaran speaking, Captain Usra Akafordala of the UHNS Unrelenting. We are ready to receive you on board whenever you wish. We have guest quarters ready. We look forward to the conversation. The Admiral read it twice. We have guest quarters ready. They had prepared for guests. They knew a senior Dominion representative would come sooner or later, and they had prepared a place for that representative. We look forward to the conversation, not a meeting, nor negotiations, nor an assessment or a summit, or a formal exchange of diplomatic credentials, a conversation, as if it were something they had long wanted and were glad it was finally happening. He turned to Prexton. Gather what you need, he said. You're coming with me. Prexton looked at him. "You found it?" the Admiral said. "You have yet to see the rest." That evening, in the silence of the intelligence deck of the long thought of time, Prexton opened the archive of open Tyran communications. He had access to 80 years of signals that the planet had broadcast their news, their entertainment, their government messages, their scientific publications. All of it was collected automatically by the sector monitoring systems and stored without verification. He looked for references to the Dominion, to First Contact, to the reconnaissance group that had come and gone. He found them within the first 10 minutes. Public records, official government announcements, news reports available to any citizen of the planet who wanted to read them. Reconnaissance was not a secret on their side. They knew exactly what had happened. He read 80 years of their public response to the knowledge that there was something larger and more developed than them, and it had found them and left without explaining why. He read political documents, defense proposals, scientific arguments, public debates. He read the laws that funded their early research into superluminal speeds. He read shipyard order reports. He read speeches given by officials at the launch ceremonies of their fleet's first ships. It was all public. It was all available to anyone who looked. Nobody looked. He added a second line to his personal log. They weren't hiding, we weren't looking. Outside, the Unrelenting held its position with its lights on, waiting for morning. The shuttle from the long thought of time crossed the distance between the two ships in 20 minutes. Vetsaran sat in the front seat and looked at the Unrelenting growing in the porthole the whole way. It was a conscious choice. He wanted to look at it without the mediation of a sensor screen, without numbers and readings between him and the reality of the thing. He wanted his eyes to do the work and report honestly. His eyes reported that the sensor data was accurate, and accurate data is not the same as being prepared. The ship filled the porthole before they were halfway there. Then it filled more than the porthole. Then the porthole could show only a part of it at a time, and he had to mentally assemble the parts into a whole, like reconstructing a large picture from photographs. The hull surface up close wasn't smooth steel. It was geography, ridges and recesses, and layered plates and structural channels running in parallel lines across the surface like the grain of something that had grown, not been built. Navigation lights were positioned along it at regular intervals, steady and white, and they were very far apart, which spoke of the distances involved. The shuttle bay was large enough to house 6 Dominion frigates. They landed in one corner. Captain Usra Akafordala was at the bottom of the boarding ramp. She was in the same dark uniform she had worn on the Unrelenting, with the same small brooch on her left lapel. She looked exactly as she had 2 weeks ago, which meant she looked like a person who had expected this and was not surprised. That it had arrived? "Admiral Vetsaran," she said. "Captain," he said. "Pleased to see you again. Welcome to Earth." She looked briefly at the blue sky, then back at him, and in that look was something between pride and relief, which he noted to think about later. "Come, they are ready for you." The conference room was on the 4th floor of the facility. It was a medium-sized room with a long table, chairs on both sides, water pitchers at regular intervals, and windows looking out over a flat green landscape under a blue sky. The ceiling was a standard height for any workroom in any functional building. The lighting was sufficient. The coffee, which was offered immediately upon their arrival, was mediocre. The Tyran Council was already seated when the delegation entered. There were 11 of them. Vetsaran had prepared carefully for this meeting, as with everything else. He had studied the available intelligence on the Tyran Council, their service records, their positions, their political history, their public statements over the last decades. He had performed scenario analysis. He had prepared for a range of opening positions from the humans, from cautious cooperation to insistent demands. He had prepared Rasputin demands. He had spent considerable time on the more complex scenarios. He looked at the 11 people sitting at the table. They looked tired, not performative tiredness, not the fatigue that signals importance and sacrifice, just genuine, human-looking tiredness. That's how people look when they have worked long and hard on something. And it is finally happening, and the adrenaline of preparation had given way to the weight of the moment. The chair of the council was a man in his early 60s named Thomas Adami. He had been a civil engineer before he entered government, which Prexton noted as unusual and worthy of attention. He had been a member of the Tyran Council for 12 years. He had no military experience. He had been council chair for 3 years, and his tenure was marked, according to their public records, by one primary priority: the completion of the twin ships, unrelenting and patience of time, and the establishment of the border monitoring program. He stood when the delegation entered. The rest stood with him. "Admiral Vetsarin," he said. His Kitiyan standard was accurate and with an accent, clearly learned, not natural. Nevertheless, he had learned it. "Thank you for making the trip. Please, sit." They sat. Water pitchers were passed. Mediocre coffee was distributed. Someone on the human side said something quietly to a neighbor, and the second person laughed quietly, then composed themselves. Silence settled in the room. Vetsaran opened the session with a prepared speech. He delivered it well. He had rehearsed it, which for him was atypical, but the circumstances were abnormal. The statement spoke of the Dominion's recognition of the contact, their desire to formalize relations, and their interest in establishing a framework for mutual interaction. He watched as the Tyrant Council listened. They listened politely. They nodded in the right places. When he finished, Ademi thanked him for the statement and said that the Council had reviewed the proposed Dominion Framework document and had some thoughts. Then he set down the official folder he was holding and folded his hands on the table. "Before we go through the details," he said, "I would like to say something that isn't in any document." He looked at Vetsaran intently. 80 years. That's a long time to not know if they would return. We spent that time doing what we considered necessary. We are very glad to be sitting at this table. 1. The room was quiet for a moment. "So are we," said Vetsaran, and it was genuine. The territorial concessions started first, because the Dominion delegation had carefully prepared them, and starting with a significant offer was a reasonable diplomatic strategy. The document outlined 3 border adjustments that expanded the recognized Tiran sovereign zone, ceded resource rights in the neighboring sector region, and formally removed the classification of the Tiran system as a quarantine zone. Ademi read it. He passed it to a council member next to him, who read it and passed it on. At the end of the table, the last council member read it and looked up. "We appreciate this," said Ademi, "but I want to ensure we don't misunderstand the framework. We are not looking for territory. We have 1 star system, and we are still working on it." A small pause. "We would like to discuss something else." Vetsaran waited. "We want to know what the rules are," said Ademi. "How does this work? If something threatens us, not the Dominion's interests, just us, something we face that we cannot handle alone, can we ask for help? And if something threatens you and you need to pass through our space, are we partners, or are we just in the way?" The Dominion delegation exchanged looks. This was one of the scenarios they had prepared for. It was not the one they had spent the most time on. "You want a mutual defense framework agreement," said Vetsaran. "We want to not be alone," said Ademi. It wasn't a complaint. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the directness of a man who had thought about it long enough that all the complex emotional layers had smoothed out. This was what it had been all along. This was why they had built what they had built. Not to threaten anyone, not to take anything. They just didn't want to be alone against something they couldn't see coming. Prexton sat below the Admiral. He wasn't taking notes. He was just listening, and his expression was that of a man whose hypothesis had just been confirmed after a long sitting in uncertainty. The proposal for technology sharing followed next. The Dominion had prepared a proposal of significant scale. Improvements in superluminal architecture, advancements in materials science, medical technology, communication infrastructure, things an evolving civilization would have reached on its own in decades. The Tiran Council was genuinely interested in the practical, concrete manner of people who had lists of problems they wanted to solve. They asked good questions. They rejected 2 items where the proposed Dominion implementation did not fit the Tyrant infrastructure. They had clearly done their own significant preparation, but were not desperate. This was what quietly rearranged everything the delegation had prepared. The Dominion had assumed, without saying it directly, without testing the assumption, that a Class F civilization facing a Dominion delegation would approach the meeting from a position of need, that there would be leverage, that the form of negotiation would be the form of all others, where one party has more and the other wants it. Humans wanted things. They were ready to negotiate, but they weren't reaching. They had 7 ships. They had 3 more under construction. Behind them stood 80 years of continuous development. And everything that was in that archive that intelligence was still working on, they had built everything they needed to keep building, and they had done so before the Dominion sat at this table. And nothing that happened at this table changed the fact that they had already done it. The question of leverage was quietly resolved. Throughout the morning, there wasn't any for either side. There were just two civilizations sitting at a table trying to figure out how to divide the galaxy so that the division didn't become a problem. It turned out that this was not the worst position for negotiation. The summit broke for lunch. The humans organized food from several of their regional traditions. The Dominion delegation ate cautiously and found most of it acceptable, and one dish from the West African section of the table genuinely good in a way that surprised many who hadn't expected to be surprised by food today. Vetsaran walked out. The facility had a small garden on the side, facing away from the landing platform. Grass, trees, a path. He walked along the path and looked at the sky, which was a shade of blue that Kitiyan skies are not, and breathed air that was heavier than he was used to. He heard footsteps on the path behind him. He turned. There was Akafordala, holding 2 cups of mediocre coffee. She offered one. He took it. They walked a distance together without speaking. The garden was quiet. The trees moved slightly in a wind he couldn't hear, only see. "The council did well this morning," he said. "They have been waiting for this conversation for a long time," she said. "They prepared. So did we. I know." A pause. "Your territorial offer was generous. It was sincere." She nodded. "I know that too." They reached a bench and stopped. Neither of them sat. They stood side by side and held their coffee and looked at the garden. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Not for the record, not for any document." "Okay." He thought about how to phrase it. He had thought about it in the shuttle. He had thought about it throughout the morning session. It wasn't a diplomatic or tactical question. It was a question that existed in the space between what people said officially and what was true. "The Unrelenting," he said. "The design. Everything I saw in the tour. I understood at the end, as a response to not knowing why we came and went. Uncertainty. Fear of the worst-case scenario." "Yes," she said. "I want to understand the fear itself, not the reaction to it, what you were afraid of." He looked at her. "What was the worst-case scenario? When you imagined the scenario you were building against, what did it look like?" She paused. She looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at the trees moving in the soundless wind. "The worst-case scenario," she said, "was that you returned and didn't ask." She paused. "Not war, necessarily. Not an attack. Just arriving and informing us. How it would be. How you do with something about which you have already decided. And we wouldn't have a voice, or the opportunity to have a voice. And it would just happen to us." She looked at him. "We weren't afraid of you specifically," she said. "We were afraid of becoming the type of civilization that things happen to, about which decisions are made without consultations, which is governed." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "So we decided to become something else instead." He stood with that for a moment, something else. Not a threat, not an aggressor, not even essentially a military force, just a civilization that had decided firmly and at great expense and over a very long time that it would be consulted, that it would be at the table, not on the agenda. The Unrelenting. It's not a weapon. It's a seat at the table, the largest, most re-engineered, 9-layered, 8-engined, 6,000 crew seat at the table that has ever been built by people who weren't going to trust that an invitation would come on its own. He looked at the sky. "We should have talked to you," he said. "When we came 80 years ago. We should have introduced ourselves." "Yes," she said. "You should have." It wasn't said with bitterness. It was said as one acknowledges a true thing. He accepted it as well. "I will include that recommendation in the record," he said, "for future reconnaissances, for the protocol." She nodded. "That would be good." They finished their coffee in silence. The garden was still. Above them, invisible in the blue, the Unrelenting held its position with its lights on and waited for the morning. The afternoon session produced the framework document. It took 4 hours. There were disagreements on 3 points and solutions for all 3. The mutual defense clause was the longest negotiation. 40 minutes on the exact wording of when the clause is activated and who can apply it. The humans wanted broad wording. The Dominion's legal advisors wanted it specific. They found a compromise that the lawyers of both sides would refine over the next decade and which would, nevertheless, hold in 2 situations. When it was applied over the next century, the technology-sharing agreement was straightforward in comparison. The framework agreement on joint research was agreed upon in 20 minutes and eventually led to 11 significant achievements that neither civilization would have reached on its own. The territorial concessions were reviewed. The Tyran Council rejected the initial proposal and suggested a smaller, more specific border adjustment that solved a practical navigation problem their ships had been bypassing. It was a more modest request than what the Dominion delegation had prepared, and the delegation accepted it without hesitation. Ademi signed the document with a pen, a real pen, the kind that leaves ink on paper. He noticed the Dominion delegation looking at it. "We have planned to sign this for a long time," he said. "I wanted to use something that would last." He passed it to Vetsaran. The admiral looked at the pen for a moment, then signed. The delegation stayed on the planet for 3 days. There were additional sessions, working group meetings, an official dinner that was warmer than official dinners usually are, and several long conversations in corridors and gardens and by coffee machines that no one reported on but which had as much significance as anything in the documents. On the last morning, Prexton sat in a small courtyard and reread the original reconnaissance report. He had read it many times over the last weeks. He returned to it, as one returns to a thing that does not yet make sense, waiting for the angle that will make it understandable. He read the conclusion again. Class F. Noth. Observation interval 200 years. He thought about everything that this conclusion missed, not because it was wrong in the facts. It was right in the facts. It was wrong in the question. He read it again, then closed the file. He opened his personal log and added a third and final entry he would make about this contact under the 2 lines he had written before. 3 lines together will eventually be published in the official Abrakarma Reconnaissance Review. Mistakes of First Contact, and will be read by every new analyst joining the division over the next 300 years as the first item in their foundational training. First line, "We forgot to check what they were afraid of." Second line, "They weren't hiding, we weren't looking." Third line, written in the courtyard on a planet with a blue sky that touched him in a way he hadn't expected. What a civilization builds in fear tells you more about it than what it builds in confidence. We should have asked earlier. We should always ask earlier. He closed the log. The shuttle rose from the facility late in the day. Vetsaran sat in the front seat again, in the same seat he had occupied on the way down, and watched as Earth receded in the porthole. The blue atmosphere thinned into blackness. The planet curved below, green and brown, covered with slow white swirls of weather systems, illuminated on one side and dark on the other. Just as it had been when the first reconnaissance group saw it 80 years ago and wrote their report, flew away. The Unrelenting was above them, huge and patient, holding its orbit. As the shuttle rose toward it, it grew in the porthole, just as it had during the approach 2 weeks ago, filling more and more of the frame until the frame could not contain it. He looked at the hull, the layered plates, navigation lights, recessed weapons ports, and wide upper structures, and at the sheer mass of this object hanging in the space around the planet it had been built to protect. He thought of the 9 layers of armor. The outer 3 were designed to be destroyed. He thought of the 8 engines running on different physical principles. He thought of the 6,000 crew members, enough for the ship to keep fighting when half of it was gone. He thought of Ademi's pen, the one that left ink on paper because they had planned to sign for a long time. He thought of Akafordala with a cup of coffee in her hand, saying, "We weren't afraid of you specifically. We were afraid of becoming the type of civilization that things happen to." The shuttle passed the Unrelenting and continued on to the long thought of time, smaller and cleaner, built on the principle that you construct exactly what you need and no more. He thought that incremental escalation was a reasonable philosophy. He thought it was based on an assumption that you understand the situation well enough to measure correctly, that you know what the situation requires. He thought that this assumption needed more careful study in the future. He thought that Earth and the 80 years spent answering a question no one thought to ask was a very good reason to study it. The long thought of time filled the porthole. The docking bay opened to receive them. Below, the planet slowly rotated in orbit. Blue and green, unremarkable from afar, going about its business just as it had been doing for 4 billion years, mostly without attention. Vetsaran submitted the report on the summit on the way home. It was thorough and clear and covered everything that needed to be covered. In the recommendations section, he wrote 3 things. The first was that a permanent diplomatic mission should be immediately established on Earth. The second was that the reconnaissance protocol should be revised to require an introduction, a formal message to any newly contacted civilization, explaining who the Dominion is, why the reconnaissance group came, and how to establish contact if they wish. The third was that the Tyran sector archive should be fully processed and reviewed, and that a permanent team should be assigned for the ongoing monitoring of open human communications. He paused before the last line of recommendations. then wrote, "Humanity didn't surprise us because they were exceptional. They surprised us because we stopped paying attention. The lesson isn't about them, it's about us." He saved the report and sent it. The Unrelenting maintained its orbit. Its lights burned steadily. It had nowhere to rush. It had time.